Anyone who grew up in a black household in the 1960s South remembers a kitchen that fed a whole family on almost nothing. The garden out back did the heavy lifting, the stove never really cooled, and a good cook could turn a morning's worth of okra and a few cents into supper for 11. These were dishes handed down from women who had cooked through Reconstruction, built from what the season gave and what a tight budget allowed. Number 19 on this list turned a tree full of peaches into the most fought over dessert in 3 counties. Number 7 on this list built a Sunday dinner from parts the butcher gave away. The food industry spent 60 years trying to replace these dishes with frozen dinners, then called the originals unhealthy. So hit subscribe and pull up a chair, because here are 25 African American summer dishes from the 1960s that are too good to forget. Number 25, tomato sandwich. The simplest summer dish in the Black South started with the tomato still warm from the vine, a thick slice of white bread, a smear of mayonnaise, a tomato cut heavy enough to bend the bread, and a hard shake of salt. That was the whole recipe. In the 1960s, a garden tomato cost nothing. Families in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia grew them by the bushel along fence lines and beside the porch steps. Children ate them like apples, straight off the vine with salt in their pockets. The supermarket tomato that replaced it was bred for shipping durability and picked green. It looked the same. It tasted like cardboard. Anyone who has eaten both knows the difference without needing a laboratory to confirm it. Number 24, fried okra. Okra hit its peak in July and August, and black families fried it the same way their great-grandmothers had since before the Civil War. The pods were sliced thin, rolled in cornmeal, seasoned with salt and pepper, and dropped into a cast iron skillet with enough lard or bacon grease to come halfway up the sides. The trick was oil temperature. Too cool and the cornmeal turned soggy. Too hot and the outside burned before the inside cooked through. A grandmother who had done it for 40 years never needed a thermometer. She flicked a pinch of cornmeal into the grease and listened. Okra came to North America through the slave trade carried from West Africa. By the 1960s, it grew in nearly every black garden south of the Mason-Dixon line, and frying it was as natural as breathing. Before we go on, for anyone who wants recipes like these and the others this channel has covered, all gathered in one place, they're in a book called Big Mama's Soul Food Kitchen over at my website, thehungryhistorian.com. That is the only time it comes up in this video. If you want it, it is there. Now back to the list. Number 23, cucumber and onion salad. This was the dish that showed up cold on the table when the kitchen was too hot to stand in. Thin sliced cucumbers and white onions sat in a bowl of white vinegar, water, sugar, and salt, chilled until the rings went translucent. Some families added hot sauce, others floated tomato slices on top. The recipe required no heat, no oven, and no standing over a stove, which made it the default side on the worst days of August. A cucumber from the garden, an onion from the pantry, vinegar from the shelf. The bowl sat on the table all day, passed from hand to hand as people came through the kitchen, and nobody complained about leftovers. It got better the longer it sat. By evening, the cucumbers had gone almost translucent, soaked through with vinegar and sweetness. Number 22, smoked neck bones and green beans. A pot of green beans in a black kitchen in the 1960s was never just green beans. It started with smoked neck bones dropped into water and simmered until the meat pulled from the bone, filling the kitchen with the kind of smell that carried to the front porch. The green beans went in after the broth turned dark with pork fat. They cooked low and slow for 2 hours until the beans were soft enough to fall apart. Summer was peak season because the beans came straight from the garden, snapped by hand on the porch while children played in the yard. A bowl of those beans was a full meal with cornbread. People who never grew up on them called them overcooked. The families who ate them never asked for a second opinion. Number 21, watermelon rind pickles. Nothing went to waste in a black kitchen, and watermelon was no exception. After the red flesh was eaten, the rind was peeled, cubed, and soaked overnight in salt water. The next morning it simmered with vinegar, sugar, cinnamon sticks, and cloves until it turned glassy and sweet, then packed into mason jars and sealed. These pickles showed up at church suppers, reunions, and 4th of July cookouts. They tasted like nothing the grocery store ever sold because the grocery store threw the rind away. A single watermelon produced a pound of pickles, and in a good summer, a family put up a dozen jars. They lined the pantry shelves like proof that nothing in this house went to waste. The women who made them could stretch a dollar further than any accountant, and they never needed a lesson in sustainability. Number 20, butter beans with ham hocks. Butter beans were the quiet workhorse of the summer garden. They grew fast, produced heavy, and dried well for storage. Black families in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia shelled them on the porch in the evening, dropping the pale green beans into a bowl while the empty pods piled into a paper sack. The cooking started with a smoked ham hock and water. The beans simmered for an hour until the potlikker thickened into a gravy that soaked through cornbread like butter. A pot of butter beans fed a large family for 2 days and cost less than the gas to cook them. The ham hock was often the only purchased meat that week, used first in the beans, then boiled again for the greens, then picked clean for stock. Some families dropped a dry red pepper in for heat. Others let the smoke do the talking. Either way, the sound at the table was the same, spoons scraping the bottom of the bowl. Here is something worth saying out loud. The summer garden in a black household in the 1960s South was not a hobby, it was an economic system. A quarter-acre plot behind the house produced tomatoes, okra, cucumbers, green beans, butter beans, and sweet potatoes from May through October. The seeds came from last year's crop, saved in paper bags on the pantry shelf. The fertilizer came from kitchen scraps and chicken manure. The labor was family labor, divided by age. Children weeded, teenagers picked, grandmothers canned. A family of 8 could eat fresh vegetables for 5 months without spending $1 at the store. When the season ended, the canning began, and those jars carried the garden through winter. The grocery chains that moved into black neighborhoods in the 1970s did not offer anything better. They just made it easier to forget what had been there all along. Number 19, peach cobbler. Peach cobbler was the dessert that started fights, the kind of argument families carried for decades about whose crust was flakier and whose grandmother held the only correct recipe. In the 1960s, nearly every black household in the rural South had a peach tree in the yard or a neighbor's, producing more fruit than any family could eat. The cobbler was built in a cast iron skillet greased thick with butter. Flour, butter, sugar, and milk went in the bottom, and sliced peaches tossed with sugar, cinnamon, and a pinch of nutmeg went on top. The batter rose around the fruit as it baked into a golden shell that cracked when a spoon pressed through it, and the juice pooled into a warm syrup that tasted like the whole summer in one bite. Church suppers in July were quietly judged by the cobbler table, and the women who won never said a word. By the 1980s, canned peaches replaced fresh in most kitchens, and the cobbler from those cans tasted flat and metallic. The recipe is not lost. The trees are. Number 18, fried catfish. Friday night fish fry was a summer institution in black communities across the South. The catfish came from local ponds, rivers, and creeks, caught that afternoon by a father or uncle who knew every good hole by name. The fish was cleaned, scored, dipped in seasoned cornmeal, and fried in a cast iron skillet filled with peanut oil. The oil had to be hot enough to seal the cornmeal the instant the fish went in. Sides with coleslaw, hush puppies, and hot sauce. Neighbors came without invitation because the smell carried 3 houses down. Nobody charged admission. The cost was a hook, some bait, and patience on the bank. The grocery stores that started selling farm-raised catfish fillets in the 1990s sold convenience. They did not sell the evening. A fish fry in July was not just a meal. It was the whole evening spread on newspaper in the backyard, eaten with hands and remembered decades later. Number 17, corn on the cob. Sweet corn was picked in July when the kernels were still milky and tender, and it went into boiling water within the hour. The silk was stripped on the porch, and children fought over who got the biggest ear. It was boiled in salted water, then rolled in butter until the surface glistened. At summer cookouts, ears went directly on the grill grate over charcoal with the husk still on, roasted until the outer leaves blackened and curled. Pulling back that charred husk to reveal steaming corn underneath was one of the quiet rituals of summer that nobody photographed because nobody imagined it would ever stop. The butter melted on contact and pooled in the rows between the kernels. Children ate it holding both ends, turning the ear like a typewriter roller, faces shining with grease. Number 16, chow-chow relish. Chow was the condiment that went on everything and came from whatever the garden produced faster than anyone could eat. Green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, and peppers were chopped fine, mixed with vinegar and sugar, and cooked until the kitchen smelled sharp and sweet at the same time. Families across the Carolinas, Georgia, and Tennessee sealed it in jars beside the watermelon rind pickles, and it lasted into the following spring. Chow-chow turned a plain plate of beans and cornbread into something with bite. The relish aisle at the grocery store today carries nothing that resembles what came out of those kitchens. The commercial versions are sweeter, blander, and missing the vinegar edge that made the original cut through a plate of heavy food. A grandmother's chow-chow had teeth. It woke the palate between bites of pork and beans and greens, and it turned a plain supper into something layered. Number 15, blackberry dumplings. Blackberry season lasted about 3 weeks in July, and black children in the rural South knew every bramble patch within walking distance. The berries grew wild along fence rows and ditch banks, and picking them was hot, scratchy work that left hands stained purple for days. The berries cooked down with sugar and water until they burst and the juice turned thick. Strips of biscuit dough dropped in next, covered with a lid, and steamed for 15 minutes. The result was soft dough swimming in dark berry syrup, served warm with cold buttermilk poured on top. This was not a fancy dessert. It was a farm dessert made from what grew free and what the pantry already held. The children who picked those berries earned every bite. They came home with scratched arms, purple-stained shirts, and a bucket heavy enough to require both hands. The dumplings that appeared an hour later were the direct reward for that labor, and they tasted like it. Number 14, sugar cane wasn't a snack you asked for. It appeared when someone came back from the right place with a stalk tucked under their arm. In Louisiana, Mississippi, and parts of Georgia and South Carolina, where cane was still grown through the 1970s, a length of sugar cane cut from the field and carried home was understood by every child in the household without explanation. You stripped the outer skin with a knife or your teeth if you didn't have one, bit down into the pale inner stalk, and chewed out the sweetness. The juice was cool and green sweet and tasted like nothing else. Not candy, not fruit, something more fundamental than either. West African agricultural traditions had brought sugar cane cultivation knowledge to the American South through enslaved people, and the practice of eating raw cane predated the sugar industry itself. The cane fields have contracted dramatically since the 1970s, and the casual access to a fresh stalk that rural children once took for granted has become rare enough that most people under 40 have never tasted it. Number 13, potato salad. Potato salad at a black cookout was not a side dish, it was a reputation. Potatoes were boiled tender but firm, then mixed with chopped boiled eggs, sweet pickle relish, celery, onion, yellow mustard, and mayonnaise. Some families added paprika on top, others folded in a spoonful of sugar that nobody discussed. The bowl chilled overnight and came out the next afternoon, cold and set. A woman who brought bad potato salad heard about it, not directly, never directly, but through the specific silence that followed when someone tasted it and quietly reached for the greens instead. That silence carried more weight than any spoken review. The best potato salad at any cookout was never the one people talked about. It was the one that disappeared first, the empty bowl sitting on the table like a verdict that needed no explanation. Number 12, collard greens with potlikker. Collard greens grew through the hottest months, and black families harvested them by the armful. The leaves were stripped from their stems, washed 3 times for grit, and stacked in a dark green pile that looked like enough for a regiment. It cooked down to a fraction. The greens went into a pot with smoked ham hock, water, vinegar, salt, and red pepper flakes, simmering for 2 hours until the leaves turned silky and the liquid at the bottom became a dark, smoky broth. That broth, the potlikker, was the prize. People drank it from a cup. Cornbread dunked into it was not optional. Throwing it out was an offense grandmothers did not forgive. The greens themselves were the meal, but the potlikker was the inheritance. Children who grew up drinking it from a tin cup on summer evenings carry that taste into their 70s and 80s. Here's the part that does not fit on a grocery label. Black families in the American South were eating locally, seasonally, and nose to tail decades before those words became marketing copy. The summer kitchen ran on what grew nearby, what could be canned for winter, and what could stretch across a table that seated 8. Nothing was wasted. Bones became broth, rinds became pickles, rendered fat became cooking oil for the next meal. This was not poverty cooking, this was precision, an entire food system that operated without refrigerated trucks, without plastic packaging, and without a single trip to a supermarket that did not yet exist. When the supermarkets arrived, they brought convenience and shelf life, but they also brought distance. Distance between the family and the food, distance between the cook and the source. The dishes on this list come from a time before that distance set in. That is why they taste different in memory than anything on a shelf. Number 11, fried green tomatoes. Fried green tomatoes were born from impatience. They showed up on tables in early summer when the plants were loaded but nothing had ripened. Firm green slices went through buttermilk, then cornmeal mixed with flour and salt, then into a skillet of hot bacon grease until both sides turned golden. The taste was tart and rich at the same time, nothing like a ripe tomato. Families served them alongside fried chicken, pork chops, or just rice and gravy. The dish faded from daily cooking when families moved north during the Great Migration and lost access to the garden. A woman in Chicago could find cornmeal and bacon grease easily enough, but a firm green tomato picked that morning from a plant 10 feet from the kitchen door was not something a grocery store could replace. You cannot fry what you cannot grow. Number 10, banana pudding. Banana pudding ended arguments. It showed up at church suppers, reunions, and Sunday dinners and nobody ever sent it home with leftovers. Vanilla wafers lined the bottom of a baking dish. Sliced bananas went over the wafers. A cooked custard of eggs, sugar, milk, and vanilla was poured over everything while still warm, softening the wafers and soaking into the fruit. Meringue from the leftover egg whites was spread on top and baked until the peaks turned gold. Timing was unforgiving. The pudding had to be served the same day before the bananas darkened and the wafers dissolved. A banana pudding made the night before was edible. One made that morning was a different thing entirely. The women who made the best versions guarded the wafer to custard ratio the way other families guarded farmland. It was not written in a recipe box. It lived in the hands, in the exact moment when the custard thickened enough to coat the back of a spoon. When that woman was gone, the pudding was never quite the same. Number 9, smothered cabbage with smoked sausage. A head of cabbage and a link of smoked sausage fed 6 people in a black household in the 1960s for less than 50 cents. The sausage was sliced thick and browned until the fat rendered out. The cabbage went into the same pot sitting in those drippings. Onion, salt, pepper, and a splash of vinegar. The lid went on. It cooked low until the cabbage collapsed into a soft, smoky tangle that absorbed every drop of sausage fat. The house smelled like it for 2 days. This was not the dish that anyone bragged about at the church supper, but it was the dish that empty plates came back from, scraped to the glaze. The people who ate it on Wednesday nights in July know the taste exactly. They do not need a recipe, they need a skillet. Number 8, pound cake. A pound cake in a black household was measured by memory. The name came from the original proportions: a pound of butter, a pound of sugar, a pound of eggs, a pound of flour. By the 1960s, most grandmothers had adjusted those ratios for their own ovens, and the adjustments were never written down. The cake was mixed by hand, poured into a greased bundt pan, and baked slow until a toothpick came out clean. Dense, buttery, golden, with a crust on the outside that cracked open to a crumb so fine it melted on the tongue. Pound cake traveled well, which made it the default offering at funerals, reunions, and summer gatherings. A woman who arrived without one had either forgotten or decided the event did not deserve her best. Both were noted. A good pound cake outlasted everything at the gathering because it tasted better the second day, the butter settling deeper into the crumb. Slicing it was a privilege reserved for the woman who had baked it. Number 7, oxtail stew. Before oxtails became expensive, they were the cheapest cut at the butcher counter. In the 1960s, black families bought them for pennies a pound because white customers refused them, which was the whole reason black families had access to one of the richest cuts on the animal. The preparation took patience. The oxtails were seasoned with garlic, onion powder, pepper, and salt, browned until a dark crust formed, then dropped into a heavy pot with onions, carrots, potatoes, a bay leaf, Worcestershire, and a spoonful of tomato paste. The pot simmered 3 to 4 hours until the meat surrendered from the bone at the touch of a fork, and the marrow dissolved into a thick, dark gravy. It was ladled over white rice when the whole family came to the table and the bones were picked clean. Children who grew up eating this know the exact flavor of that broth, which is why the current price, often $8 to $12 a pound, hits them as both insulting and predictable. The grandmothers who bought it for pocket change always knew what was in the bone. Number 6, Teacakes. Teacakes were the simplest cookie in the Black South and the one that carried the most weight. A grandmother mixed flour, sugar, butter, eggs, vanilla, and a pinch of nutmeg into a stiff dough, rolled it out on a floured board, and cut rounds with the rim of a drinking glass. They baked until the edges turned the faintest gold. and what came out was plain, barely sweet, with a soft center and a thin crust that broke gently between the teeth. In the summers of the 1960s, they waited in a tin on the counter for grandchildren who came through the kitchen door hot and dusty from the yard. The recipe was never written down in most families because it lived in the hands of the woman at the boards, measuring flour by feel and cracking eggs one-handed into the bowl. It survives in the families that stood beside her and watched, the ones who did not lose something no bakery has ever sold. Here is what was really being handed down at those summer tables. It was never just recipes. Recipes can be found in any book. What traveled from grandmother to grandchild was a way of thinking about food that treated every ingredient as valuable, every meal as shared, and every cook as a keeper of something that mattered beyond the plate. A grandmother who spent 3 hours shelling butter beans on the porch was not only preparing supper, she was teaching the child beside her patients how to work with their hands and how to feed a family without money. That knowledge traveled from Mississippi to Chicago, from Alabama to Philadelphia, from Louisiana to California, packed in the same boxes as the Sunday clothes and the cast iron skillets. The dishes survived the Great Migration because the women who made them refused to leave them behind. Number 5, pig feet. Pig feet sat in the same corner of the butcher shop as oxtails, unwanted by most, prized by those who understood them. Black families braised them in vinegar, water, onions, garlic, bay leaves, and red pepper flakes until the cartilage dissolved and the meat slid off the bone in gelatinous strips. The cooking took hours, and the smell was not subtle. It reached the neighbor's yard. Some families served them hot from the pot with rice and collard greens. Others pickled them in vinegar brine, and on summer evenings, those cold pickled pig feet came out to the porch with crackers and hot sauce, the vinegar cutting through the August humidity like nothing else on a table could. The texture was the dividing line. People who loved the pig feet loved the sticky, gelatinous pull of the meat against bone. People who did not were usually reaching for a second one while still complaining. This was not polite food. It was built to feed a family on parts that cost almost nothing and deliver a richness that expensive cuts could not touch. Number 4, deviled eggs. Every cookout had a plate of deviled eggs, and it was always the first plate emptied. Hard-boiled eggs halved, yolks scooped and mashed with mayonnaise, yellow mustard, pickled relish, salt, and pepper. The filling spooned back into the whites and dusted with paprika. The recipe was identical in almost every Black household, which made the tiny differences fiercely personal. One family added sugar, another used hot sauce, a third insisted on mashing the yolks with a fork rather than a spoon, swearing it changed the texture. The eggs traveled to cookouts in covered dishes, lined with wax paper, balanced on laps in the back seat of the car. The cook watched to see whose plate emptied first. It was the quietest competition at the table, and it ran every summer without a single word spoken about it. Number 3, boiled peanuts salted in the shell were a roadside and home staple across the rural South, made by loading raw green peanuts into a pot of heavily salted water and cooking them for 2 to 5 hours until the shells went soft and the nuts inside turned creamy and dense. The salt worked its way through the shell, and the finished nut had a texture, nothing like the roasted kind, yielding, almost starchy, with the salt hitting every bite. Sold from pots at the roadside from Georgia to Louisiana, boiled peanuts in the African American community carried a lineage that stretched back to West Africa, where groundnuts were boiled and seasoned in similar ways. You pulled the shell apart over the pot to catch the brine before it dripped. You ate standing, usually near the pot, because sitting down implied you were done, and nobody was done after just a few. The roadside pots still show up in parts of the Deep South. The ones kept going on the back of the stove at home have mostly gone cold. Number 2, crackling cornbread. Crackling cornbread was standard cornbread carrying a secret weapon. Cracklings, the crispy rendered pork skin left over from making lard, were folded into cornmeal batter before it hit a screaming hot cast iron skillet greased with bacon fat. The skillet went into the oven first, so the batter sizzled the instant it was poured. The result was golden, crispy bottom bread studded with nuggets of salty, crunchy pork that shattered when broken in half. Nothing in a bakery or grocery aisle has replicated what that cornbread did when it met a bowl of Potlikker. On summer evenings, a wedge of crackling cornbread came out of the oven and went straight to the table beside a pot of fresh butter beans, and the kitchen stayed hot for an hour afterward. Nobody minded. Bread made from the leftovers of leftovers, and better than anything sold by a company with a marketing budget. Number 1, hand-churned peach ice cream. On the hottest Saturdays of July, a wooden ice cream churn appeared on the back porch, and every child within earshot knew what was coming. The custard was cooked that morning. Eggs, sugar, cream, and vanilla heated slowly until it coated the back of a spoon, and ripe peaches from the same trees as the cobbler were peeled and folded in. The churn was packed with ice and rock salt, and the children took turns on the handle, the oldest man in the yard finishing when the resistance got too heavy to turn. What came out was not smooth like anything from a store. It was dense, grainy with crystals, thick with peach pulp, and so cold it ached behind the teeth. The youngest ate first, and the adults ate slowly in lawn chairs, scraping the sides. Number 23, watermelon rind pickles. This was the dish nobody under 40 has ever heard of. A woman in Freetown, Virginia, would eat the red flesh of the watermelon in July and then spend the next 2 days turning the white rind into pickles. She peeled off the green skin, cut the rind into 1-inch cubes, soaked them overnight in salt water, and then simmered them the next morning in a syrup of vinegar, sugar, cinnamon sticks, and whole cloves. The first known African-American cookbook, published in 1881 by Abby Fisher, included a recipe for these pickles. Fisher had been born into slavery in Alabama and later moved to San Francisco, where she was listed in the city directory as a pickle manufacturer. During the Great Depression, a woman named Patsy Randolph in Harlem collected watermelon rinds from street vendors and turned them into pickles she sold alongside pepper sauces and relishes. They were her biggest sellers. Your grandmother did not waste a thing. Generations of women before her had done the same. That was the whole tradition. Number 20, pig feet. Slow simmered until the skin went to silk and the bones gave up their richness. Pig feet were a poor table's luxury. They were boiled for hours with vinegar and pepper, sometimes pickled in a jar and eaten cold, sometimes served hot and falling apart over rice. Like so much of soul food, the feet were an offcut the enslaved were left with and turned into something worth waiting all day for. They carried the same official suspicion as the other raw pork parts during the 1960s sanitation campaigns, since handling fresh trotters meant handling raw hog that could carry bacteria into the kitchen. Health departments of the era pressed the message of careful cleaning and thorough cooking for all such cuts, the same drumbeat aimed at chitlins and maws. Cooks already knew to boil the feet long and hard until the meat all but melted, and they kept right on doing it. The warnings worried about the bacteria, but the pot kept its promise. Blood pudding with grits was a breakfast dish that appeared on rural black tables during hog killing season throughout the 1960s, using every part of the animal with reverence. Fresh pig blood was collected and mixed with cooked rice, onions, and spices before being stuffed into casings and simmered until firm. The pudding was then sliced thick and fried until the outside crisped while the inside stayed soft and richly seasoned. Served alongside creamy grits swimming in butter, the combination provided enough sustenance to fuel a full day of labor. The taste was earthy and deeply savory, with the iron-rich pudding balanced by the mild corn flavor of the grits. Though it made outsiders squeamish, families who grew up eating it remembered the dish with fondness. It represented the complete use of the hog and the wisdom of wasting nothing. Hog maw, stuffed with sausage, was a holiday centerpiece in many Black households during the 1960s, transforming the pig's stomach into something spectacular. Number 20, smoked neck bones. This was a cookout dish that did not ask for attention and did not need it. A woman in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, bought a 5-pound bag of pork neck bones for less than $1 in 1963 and turned them into the base of everything else on the table. She seasoned them with onion powder, garlic salt, and black pepper, wrapped them in foil, and set them on the edge of the grill where the heat was low. They sat there for 4 hours, slowly rendering fat and pulling away from the bone. Some women used the neck bones to flavor a pot of greens. Others served them on their own with white rice and hot sauce. The neck bone was never the centerpiece. It was the foundation. It flavored the greens, it seasoned the beans, and it stretched a meal that might not have been enough on its own. That is what cookout food used to be. Not a show, a system. Simple, cheap, and beautiful. Number 22, smothered pork chops. Smothering was the art of taking a tough, cheap chop and drowning it in gravy until it surrendered. The chops were browned in lard, then left to simmer low under a thick roux gravy built from the pan drippings and flour until the meat fell soft and the gravy ran rich and brown over the rice. It was a way to make a hard cut tender and a small portion feel like plenty, a survival skill passed down through hard times. When the saturated fat warnings spread in the 1960s, that lard and drippings gravy was precisely the cooking style the New Heart guidance flagged, all that rendered pork fat thickened and poured over everything on the plate. County home economists sometimes urged families to skim the fat or skip the gravy altogether. The kitchen heard the advice and kept the spoon in the skillet. They tried to thin the gravy down, but the family kept it thick. Fried frog legs were a delicacy that children caught and families celebrated in rural Black communities near swamps and ponds throughout the 1960s South. Boys would spend summer evenings hunting frogs with flashlights and gigs, returning home with their catch to mothers who knew exactly what to do. The legs were cleaned, soaked in buttermilk to tenderize the meat, then dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried in hot lard until golden and crispy. The meat was white and tender, tasting remarkably like chicken, but with a delicate sweetness that set it apart. Families ate them with their fingers, pulling the tender meat from tiny bones and fighting over the last pieces. The dish represented summer abundance and the joy of eating what you caught yourself. It taught children that dinner could come from the land if you were willing to work. Number 21, grilled chitlins. Most people know chitlins as a holiday dish, boiled slow in a pot with onion and vinegar. But at cookouts in the 1960s, some families took their boiled chitlins and laid them on the grill until the edges turned crisp and smoky. A man in Greenwood, Mississippi, would boil his chitlins for 3 hours the day before the cookout, drain them, season them with Cajun spice and garlic powder, and grilled them over charcoal the next afternoon. The smell traveled. That was intentional. By the 1960s, chitlins had become a charged symbol in the Black community. Activists like Elijah Muhammad criticized soul food, but many families held onto the dish as proof of survival. The chitlin circuit, a string of performance venues for Black artists, took its name from this very food. Cleaning them was the hardest part. Some families spent an entire morning at the sink, rinsing each one under cold water until it was spotless. Your family used to do that work together. Nobody wanted to do it alone, and so the dish faded. Number 17, candied yams. Sweet, glossy, and dark with brown sugar, candied yams were the dish that made a holiday plate feel like a celebration. They are sweet potatoes, slow cooked under a thick glaze of butter, brown sugar, and warm spice until the edges go syrupy and the whole pan shines. The name is a thread back to West Africa, where enslaved cooks recognized the sweet potato as kin to the yams of home and cooked it the way they remembered. As the 1960s brought new attention to what families ate, the sheer amount of sugar in dishes like candied yams drew quiet caution from nutrition writers worried about Southern cooking. Home economists sometimes suggested cutting the sugar down by half. The cooks smiled and kept the glaze deep because this was not everyday food. It was Sunday and Thanksgiving on a fork. They counted the spoonfuls of sugar, but the family counted the smiles. Chicken feet stew was a dish born from buying what the butcher practically gave away and turning it into something deeply nourishing. During the 1960s, Black families would simmer clean chicken feet for hours with onions, garlic, tomatoes, and vegetables until the collagen released into the broth. The feet became tender and gelatinous, with meat that slid off the tiny bones with surprising ease. The broth turned silky and rich, providing natural body without the need for flour or cream. Served over rice with hot sauce on a side, this stew warmed bodies and stretched budgets in ways that conventional cuts never could. Grandmothers swore by its healing properties, feeding it to sick children and recovering mothers. The dish represented kitchen wisdom passed through generations who understood that flavor hid in unexpected places. Number 24, hot links. In Chicago on the South Side, this sausage defined what a cookout tasted like. When Black families moved north during the Great Migration, they carried their food traditions from Mississippi and Alabama and set up barbecue stands in vacant lots and front yards across the city. Pitmasters in Chicago created the hot link out of coarsely ground pork seasoned with sage, crushed red pepper, and black pepper, then stuffed into hog casings. A place called Lem's Bar-B-Q, founded in 1954 by brothers from Mississippi, began serving hot links alongside rib tips on a bed of French fries with white bread on the side. By the 1960s, this combination was on every cookout table on the South Side. Your uncle did not buy them from a store. He made them. He ground the pork himself, seasoned it by hand, and smoked those links until the casing split just right. The flavor was simple and powerful. That kind of handmade hot link has almost entirely vanished from your backyard. Number 19, neck bones. There was always more flavor than meat on a neck bone, and that was exactly the point. These knobby pork bones were sold cheap, sometimes nearly given away, and a cook would brown them and let them go low and slow with onion and a little water until the gravy turned deep and the scraps of meat slipped right off. They seasoned a pot of beans or stood alone over rice, a survival dish that fed a family on next to nothing. When the 1960s heart message took hold, neck bones drew notice on two fronts: the rendered pork fat, the new saturated fat guidance warned about, and the salt that seasoned the pot. Nutrition leaflets of the day nudged families toward leaner, lower salt cooking. The cook nodded and reached for the neck bones just the same. Officials measured the fat and the salt, and the family measured the gravy. The maw was cleaned thoroughly inside and out, then stuffed with a mixture of homemade sausage, potatoes, onions, and cabbage, seasoned with sage and black pepper. Sewn shut with kitchen twine, it was roasted slowly for hours until the outer skin turned golden and crispy, while the stuffing inside became tender and flavorful. Sliced thick at the table, each piece revealed layers of meat and vegetables bound together by the maw's natural gelatin. Families served it for Christmas, New Year's, or whenever company was expected. The dish demonstrated mastery over ingredients that others might reject, proving that skill could elevate anything into a feast. Turtle soup with sherry was a dish that bridged poverty cooking and fine dining in Black communities along southern rivers during the 1960s. Snapping turtles were caught by brave souls willing to risk their fingers, then cleaned and the meat removed from the shell to reveal flesh that tasted like a cross between chicken and fish. The meat was simmered for hours with onions, celery, hard-boiled eggs, and spices until it fell apart into the rich broth. A splash of sherry added just before serving gave the soup an unexpected elegance that surprised anyone who tasted it. Served at church suppers and family gatherings, turtle soup proved that resourceful cooking could produce something genuinely refined. The dish connected families to rivers and waterways that provided free protein for those who knew how to harvest it. Number 25, slab ribs over the pit. This was the dish that announced the cookout had started. Not the music, not the dominoes, the smoke. A man in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, started his fire at 5 in the morning for a cookout that would not begin until 2 in the afternoon. He did not use a store-bought grill. He used a 50-gallon drum he had cut in half and welded hinges onto himself. He rubbed the ribs with salt, black pepper, garlic powder, and paprika the night before and let them sit in the refrigerator wrapped in newspaper. He mopped them with a vinegar and tomato sauce he kept in a mason jar under the sink. By the time the first car pulled up, those ribs had been over smoked for 9 hours. In the 1960s, pork spare ribs cost around 40 cents a pound, and a man could feed a whole block for under $5. Your grandfather did not rush that process. He passed that tradition down like a family name. That kind of slow-cooked, all-day, hand-mopped slab rib has mostly given way to gas grills and bottled sauce. The smoke does not travel the same way it used to. Number 23, crackling cornbread. This was cornbread with the gift of the hog baked right into it. Cracklings are the crisp little bits of pork skin and fat left over after rendering lard, salty and crunchy, and folding a handful into the cornmeal batter turned plain bread into something a family fought over. It was thrift-made delicious. Every scrap of the pig used, nothing wasted, a habit carried straight out of slave quarter kitchens where the offcuts were all anybody got. Then came the 1960s and the rising concern over saturated fat in the new heart studies, and cracklings were exactly the kind of pork fat indulgence the new guidance frowned on. After the American Heart Association issued its first warning on saturated fat, public health writers of the era began naming lard-rich breads among the foods to cut back on for the sake of the heart. Some county leaflets even printed cornbread recipes stripped of the cracklings. But crackling cornbread was a holiday on a plate, the crunch of the pork skin against the soft crumb, and nobody was giving that up over a pamphlet. It went on getting baked in the same black skillet and carried hot to the table. The officials counted the grease while the family counted the slices. Every dish on this list started in a kitchen where nothing was wasted. Every hand had a job. and every plate was built for the people at the table. That is what those summers carry forward, and it is the reason none of this deserves to be forgotten. 25 dishes. Every one of them tastes better in memory than anything on a shelf today. Pick one this week, fry the okra, churn the ice cream, make the cobbler with real peaches if you can still find a tree. Then drop a comment with the one dish from this list that your family turned into gold and tell us who taught you to make it. Subscribe, because this is not the last list. Somewhere in Greenville, Mississippi, that garden is still growing.